Hey everybody, my name is TJ King and I'm the host of the Peahen's Ponderings, a podcast for fiber artists. Today I'm going to show you how to use a Spanish Peacock supported spindle plying stand. Say that 5 times fast. So what is the plying stand? It's a tool that holds your spindles in place so that you can actually ply from one or more spindles onto a separate spindle in order to perform the act of plying. It's also known as a plying cate or just a cate. So let's take a look at what comes in the bag when you buy a Spanish Peacock supported spindle plying stand. The plying stand comes with a base and 2 sides, and a set of instructions which we won't go into here because I'm going to explain how to assemble the Spanish Peacock supported spindle plying stand. In order to assemble the plying stand, you have to follow some very simple instructions. Identify the back of your sides and the back of the base. It's very important that the back of the sides goes in first, and you can tell the back because it's got the more angled slots. So in order to put a side in, slide it into the back slot first, and then slightly flex the front until it can slide into the front slot. And then repeat the steps for the other arm. So the plying stand comes with several different settings so that you can put your arms closer together or further apart depending upon the size of spindle that you're spinning. If you've got pocket spindles, like pocket-sized Tibetan or pocket-sized Russian, they can go on this narrower setting. If you have fuller-sized spindles or your cop has been built up a little bit further, you might prefer the slots that are further out in order to give enough room for your spindle. A question that I get a lot is whether the holes or the grooves should go on the left or the right. For me personally, the way I spin, I like to have the tip of the spindle going through the circle on the right as I'm looking at the plying stand, and the bottom of the spindle going through the left. This gives me an overhand pull because that's how I prefer. Your mileage may vary and your spinning technique may vary. So you might prefer to have the circles on the left, again, as you're looking at it, and the grooves on the right. This is all just a matter of personal preference. At this point in the video, I'm going to switch to my own personal plying stand and continue the demonstration from there. So here you see my personal plying stand. It's been stained. The stand does come unstained, unfinished, so that you can stain it or paint it or just leave it unfinished if you prefer, whatever your personal preference is. The plying stand has a few additional features, such as felt on the inside of the grooves and the circles. This makes it so that the spindle can move more easily as you're plying, and it also prevents wood from rubbing up against wood during the process of plying. It also has silicone feet, which probably don't show up very well in this video, and this allows the stand to grip the tabletop a little more firmly so it's not moving. One of the problems I ran into back in the day when I was using a shoe box with holes punctured in the side, everybody does this at some point. You've got your shoe box with 2 or 3 holes as needed, and your spindles are in the box and you're trying to ply, and the box keeps moving. The feet on the bottom of the supported spindle plying stand prevents that from happening. Now, I should point out, it is called the supported spindle plying stand, but only because that is the type of spindle it was designed for. You absolutely can use this with other spindles that aren't supported spindles, and you can absolutely use it with non-Spanish Peacock spindles. I promise I won't tell anybody. You might need a few tricks to make it work with these other types of spindles, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So for this particular plying project, I have 3 spindles and I'm going to use them to make a 3-ply yarn. I could also use this plying stand to only hold 2 spindles to make a 2-ply yarn, or a single spindle in order to make a yarn that's chain plied. So let's talk a little bit about the differences between those 3 options. A 3-ply yarn is going to have a very soft, almost smushy kind of texture. It's very round. It's a great use for most knitting projects. It's got a very lovely drape. A 2-ply yarn, by contrast, has a much sharper edge and is better used for things like lace work, where a really sharp stitch definition is a plus. You would use 1 single spindle in this particular plying stand in the event that you were perhaps chain plying, which is also called Navajo plying, and you would use that approach if you have a fiber that gradiates from, in this case, dark brown, white, light gray, and dark gray, and you carefully spin your singles so that that color gradient is preserved. Chain plying will allow you to ply and get a 3-ply yarn, basically, that also preserves that color gradient. So if you're looking to maintain a specific color throughout your entire spinning project and subsequently your knitting project, chain plying is the way to go. As I mentioned, for this particular project, I'm going to be making a 3-ply yarn. So here are my 3 spindles. Surprise, surprise, they're all Spanish Peacock supported spindles. I know you didn't see that coming. So I'm going to insert the top of the spindle in this direction on the right as I'm facing it, and the bottom of the spindle to the left in the groove, again, as I'm facing it. Here's my second Russian spindle, and you can see from this, and you can see here how it was designed for Spanish Peacock supported spindles. They all have this groove at the base of the spindle that provides a perfect resting spot for going into this particular stand. If you happen to be using a spindle that doesn't have the groove built in, you are going to want to use a rubber band or some other mechanism to help hold it in place. For instance, this is a very vintage Spanish Peacock bead spindle, and it does not have the groove that the 2 Russian spindles do. If I had a singles on it and I was in the process of plying, the movement of the yarn would pull the spindle straight out of place and it would continue to fall. All you have to do in order to make this work is a rubber band to work as a gasket right around the end of the spindle, and that will help keep it in place during the process of plying. My 3rd spindle is a Spanish Peacock Ninja, and if you haven't worked with a Ninja before, I highly recommend them. They're my absolute favorite style of Spanish Peacock supported spindle. It's like the love child of a Tibetan and a bead. So it's got the very small whorl of a bead, but it's hollowed out on the inside like a Tibetan. This gives you the best combination of speed and momentum in a supported spindle. And I'm going to insert the guy right there. So now that we've got our spindles loaded, let's get started. My personal preference for a plying spindle is something relatively light with a comparatively large whorl. I know some people recommend a much heavier spindle when they're in the process of plying, but I'm going to be packing a lot of cop onto this spindle, and so I want it to be as lightweight as possible when I start so that my hand doesn't tire out from the constant flicking. Now remember, when you're plying, you need to flick the spindle in the opposite direction from the direction that you flicked it when you were spinning the singles. In my personal case, I spin Z. It may look backwards to you as I'm doing this demonstration because I'm going to ply S. It doesn't really matter which way you flick the spindle, either for spinning or for plying, as long as you make sure that you go in the opposite direction. So I'm going to take my singles from 1, 2, and 3 spindles. You're going to know that you're spinning the right way. Excuse me. You're going to know that you're plying the right way that you're flicking the spindle correctly for plying, because it'll feel wrong. It's not the natural movement that you make when you're spinning, because you're not spinning, you're plying, and that awkwardness helps tell you that you're on the right path. I'm going to bring this first bit of yarn down around the whorl, around the shaft, and back up. This is the same technique I used in my video on how to spin without a notch in your top whorl. And at this point, I can just keep spinning. The plying stand holds the spindles and allows me to focus my attention on yarn management and making sure that I'm continuing to spin consistent. You may need to straighten some yarns out. Since this is a very lightweight spindle, you'll notice it's trying to backspin, and it just requires a little additional attention to stay on top of that. It's very important that you feed the singles smoothly. In my case, I like a very overspun singles yarn, so I have to spend a lot of time dealing with the yarns kinking up on themselves. If you don't spin quite so tightly, it will be less of an issue for you. One other hack that I find helpful when getting ready to ply, sometimes when you're spinning your singles yarn, your spindle's full and you need it for something else. Well, I used to use a plastic straw, just set that right there temporarily, to slide my cop off of the spindle and onto the straw, and this allowed me to free up the spindle in order to use it for another project or more yarn of the same project. Well, never mind the fact that plastic straws aren't PC anymore. They're also a terrible, terrible solution for this purpose, because they're very flimsy and they're not really big enough to do the job. You see how I have this little binder clip trying to keep the cop from sliding back off. I highly recommend investing in some metal straws, especially with the little silicone bits that are used to keep the straw in place if it's through the lid of a travel cup, because these silicone bits will help hold your cup in place. Now, this doesn't always work, but let's give it a shot. I have here a Tibetan spindle that I used to spin more of the fiber that was part of these batlings, and I'm going to use this metal straw in order to free it up to use for other purposes. Now, this doesn't always work. If you wind your cop on extremely tight, or if your spindle shaft doesn't have the right amount of taper to it, this particular trick might not work, so let's see if this does. I'm going to loosen up the cop here. There we go. We've slid it off of the Tibetan spindle and onto the straw. And now, these two silicone gaskets will actually help this cop on a straw sit in the supported spindle plying stand. So it's already ready to go. As soon as one of these spindles no longer has fiber on it, I can just swap this into the exact same spot. So now you know how to use this Spanish Peacock supported spindle plying stand. One final note. While it looks like you could use this to conveniently store 3 additional spindles, please do not do this. Spindles should only ever be stored straight up and down in such a way that there's no pressure being applied to the shaft. This can introduce warpage, and that will introduce wobble while you spin, and will make for a much less pleasant spinning experience. If you have any questions still, please leave a comment below. And if there's anything else I can do a video on to help you spin better or use Spanish Peacock products better, please let me know. I'd be happy to help. Thank you. Goodbye.